love to invite my lovely panelists to introduce themselves.
So my name is John Washburn. I'm one of the lovely panelists previously mentioned.
Would any of my online panelists like to go?
Nick, he, him pronouns, another panelist.
Just to check, are all the other panelists here?
Happy.
Okay, I will presume the other panelists are also here. I cannot open the chat. Anyways, John will be keeping time signals. I encourage speakers to assign themselves. Without further ado, I invite the Prime Minister to begin the finals of the Ottawa round robin.
I guess I'll do the cringy thing where I thank some people. I hope you guys are all having fun in Ottawa. I really wished that I could have been here, but of course flights are expensive and stuff. Yeah, I hope you guys have all had fun. There's a few people. Anais, of course, for setting up this tournament is insanely cool. I hope her and Pedro are super happy. I think it's an amazing tournament they've put together. I hope it's something that continues to grow the circuit moving forward. I'd also like to shout out Carl and Emma, who I started debating with like a long time ago, and have been losing to them for a long time, hopefully not losing for this round. And thanks for Anders and Nick as well for just being cool blokes. Okay, enough sentiment. Let's get started. All right. Most of these debates are won or lost on characterization, so we're going to explain a lot on why we think that most of the depictions we're talking about in this debate are going to be done well. 4 things here. The first is that I think this is a the motion implies that this is a recent trend. So this happens under a society, and in the examples they're proposing are all within the West. You know, Netflix is under a society which mostly accepts feminists ideals, or at least corporations and executives don't want to create something that is going to be exceptionally controversial. So there's some level of backlash that keeps depictions of this in check. Second of all, I think even as with the example of 13 Reasons Why, where a lot of these depictions are done in a way that is kind of stupid or kind of irresponsible, there's discourse about why that was done well and people talking about how it could have been done better that creates conversations about the topics that these media things are discussing. Thirdly, many members of staff on the writing teams for these shows, of course, are women. The majority of women have experiences with masculinity and with patriarchal stuff, and they want to depict these in a way that is sensible and reasonable with a certain level of tact. So I think you should be careful moving forward within the debate of very flippant and unrealistic, uncharitable characterizations from opposition. The question then is why media is necessary, which is going to lead us into our first argument on having proactive discussions of toxic masculinity in society. But I just want to point out that the majority of feminist literature is incredibly dry. It's written in an academic context. It's written using language that most people don't understand, most people don't identify with. Even a majority of women don't actively identify as feminists, even if they agree with many of the things feminists are talking about. But it's also important, I think, because media allows you to show visceral depictions of things. So you see something in a way that activates your emotion, and that is a different sort of way in which you experience that kind of thing. Before I move on, any questions on framing or setup from opposition? No? Okay. So I think these shows lead to helpful discussions of toxic masculinity. First of all, I want to point out that in a lot of instances, many people, particularly men, are going to approach these shows not really expecting or not really opting into a feminist show, right? Not expecting this to be about feminism. They're just like, oh, Dahmer, someone I've heard about, you know, maybe this will be kind of exciting, maybe it'll be kind of cool. And then suddenly they see a super visceral depiction of what it's like to grow up under an extremely abusive parental figure who inundates you with a lot of toxic masculine attitudes and toxic masculine ideals. And they don't really expect to see that. So I think we access a number of people by being able to expose them to messages and expose them to ideas which otherwise you would never access under any other kind of counterfactual message or counterfactual type of art in ops world. And it's really important to access men like this because I think it helps them identify the way similar kinds of thinking patterns exist in their own lives, right? So obviously, when you watch a piece of media, you're going to self-identify with the main character or something, right? So you're going to have some level of empathy with them. It's implied in the motion that these are depicted in ways to get you to identify with these, horrible people in some way or another. And so I think the way this works is that you're watching the show, you identify some horrible experience, and then you think, I probably think similar about that in other kinds of instances. It doesn't have to happen all at once. I think just setting, laying the seed, laying the foundation in someone's brain that, sometimes it's okay to cry if you're a man. Sometimes denying yourself the right to cry bottles things up and then leads you to have a breakdown later, leads you to act out later. And then, you identify when you're going through that later on in your life because there was a previous foundation in this show setting that up for you. So I think we can preemptively, like, interfere with negative thinking patterns and reach a lot of men and get messages to them that is very valuable and encourage them to make better decisions in their lives. But second of all, I think it is important to identify within the progressive movement that many men are legitimately victimized by patriarchy. There's a growing gulf in between, like, young people where more and more young men are turning far right, more and more young women are moving to the left. And I think it's important to note that poor, racialized men are massive victims of toxic masculinity, right? They're double victimized by all sorts of other types of oppression. And I think when messages within the broader feminist movement or broader progressive circles deny that this kind of harm is manifesting into their life, I think they become alienated because they feel nobody's talking about this kind of issue. And that leads them to be more susceptible to other kinds of negative narratives, like the kind of narratives, that we're trying to push back against. So, Trumpism and Andrew Tate kind of stuff. Anything from closing before I move into the second argument?
Opening? Go for it.
Yeah, opening. Sure.
Yeah, Ted Lasso depicts toxic masculinity. Why do we specifically need to see people being murdered in order to introduce this idea into the discourse?
Ted Lasso reaches a different audience, more depictions of people who are being more chances for us to get this message out is a good thing. But sure, our second argument is entirely exclusive, which is on generating more empathy for criminals in particular. I think there's a rise in far-right populism. There's a rise in tough-on-crime measures, like, say, anti-immigration movements in Europe. I think it's important to encourage political support for prison reform in places like America, which executes tons of criminals, execute tons of innocent criminals every single year. And we'll bite the bullet here. I just think violent criminals do deserve to live a dignified life in prison. I don't see any point in torturing someone for no reason. If somebody is a serial killer and they're not going to hurt someone again, I don't see any point in making their life any more miserable. We think that creates more utility for the world. But I think it's also important to point out that lots of people genuinely aren't at fault for horrific crimes they commit, right? Black people commit significantly more crime than white people per capita in the United States. The reason for that is they live under an oppressive system, right? So obviously, I think there's a lesser degree of accountability for those individuals. And if they're going to be punished by an extremely oppressive state apparatus, we would prefer that state apparatus to be operated by people who have more empathy towards criminals because they watched a documentary series, they watched a television show that encouraged them to think about how experiences and traumatic events in someone's childhood lead them to make negative decisions, right? But there's also, a hell of a lot of people who are innocent who wind up in these prison systems. In as far as we generate political support for some level of improvement, I think that's an additional impact here. So two big ideas. One is that you generate a lot of preemptive thinking in men to think about toxic masculine attitudes, encourage them to think differently. And secondly, general public gets more support for reforming a prison system that is often horrifically oppressive and bad. Thanks, Erik.
I thank that member for that devious speech and now invite the leader of opposition.
My major is in criminology, so of course I watch a lot of true crime shows, and that is how I know that this media has to be extremely simplistic. Why? Because we know that the average person has a short attention span. We need for there to be a clear thesis, a simplistic thesis, that narratives can cause certain behaviors that can appeal to brain-dead audiences, which is why there is a lot of exposition where people simplistically link the narrative of masculinity to making them do these violent things. They sit down and they talk to the camera and they say, I was under all these pressures and these pressures made me a fundamentally evil person. You have to do this to make you clear. But second, because The inclusion of nuance confuses this thesis. It is impossible for, in the same narrative of a 30-minute episode, to say that the same father who beats you for wearing dresses is also the father who bought you your first baseball bat. That the boys who you enjoy spending time with are also the boys who prevent you from showing any emotion. But second, that these are short clips. You have to compress like years-long saga of crime and a years-long saga of events into a very short time frame. So it makes it seem like small moments and small instances where someone says something as simple as, you know, you should have been a stronger man, can lead to the significant and horrible and extreme reactions that distort the causal and nuanced reasons for why crime are committed. Why should you weigh this above the opening government characterization? First, it's about the level at which you have feedback. Feedback comes after the content has already been produced. It is already out there, so it probably doesn't matter. But second is the profit incentive. Look, it doesn't matter what review you get on Rotten Tomatoes. Many people who watch it, one, still believe it, but second, the profit that you get from clicks and by making it seem like, you know, this societal phenomenon has caused people to go crazy outweighs that. But I think third, that mental health is poorly understood. After we watched 13 Reasons Why, people thought that watching people talk about mental health could convince you to kill yourself. You did not know necessarily that this was not true. And especially the people you want to be understanding men's mental health don't have a frame of reference on which to contradict this. You don't know that, you know, this is not how toxic masculinity works if you don't understand toxic masculinity in the first place. So for all these reasons, yes, people do buy in. There aren't significant reasons or any possibility for these narratives to get better. Why is this then bad? Our first constructive is on how this garners unproductive and bad reactions. Firstly, that this harms the existent dialogue between feminists and men's mental health activists and contributes to the false dichotomy of animosity where, you know, they are very against each other. First, that this allows right-wing extremists and, you know, clickbait farmers such as Andrew Tate to claim that this is part of the man-hating feminist agenda. There is a significant margin here. First, they are always looking for evidence. So even if this is not explicitly tied to feminist movements, you are likely to say that this is part of the feminist movement's agenda because you make money off of saying that there is an other that hates men. But second, for the reasons they identify, that there are female writers in these courtrooms, that Hollywood seems like a very woke industry at times. You do associate this with feminists. I'll take you in just a second. But I think thirdly, that this depiction is somewhat mainstream. So the fact that it exists in the first place seems to be evidence that the man-hating agenda has become so big it can infiltrate people's screens. The impact here is it's so dramatic that it can be easily spread. It is entertaining to watch. There are flashy lights. It is filmed in an interesting way. They use dramatic voices. So people tend to watch these clips and then feel massive amounts of anger towards the feminist movement. But at the same time, I think this convinced many burgeoning feminists that men are the enemy. And I want to impact this claim. First, that it spreads much faster because it adds to the pool of evidence that there already is. But second, that the clips that do exist, even if they are productive discourses, get watered down by commentary, by people on both sides who overreact to this evidence and make it seem really extreme and make it seem like evidence. This is seen in the backlash to things like the Gillette ad, where it was literally an ad about, you know, how men are sometimes toxic masculine, and then became a whole thing about how it is clear that women hate men. When the impacts of this are so clear, right, it first changes the way people walk through the world. The fact that men walk through the world believing that women hate them. The fact that they walk through the world believing that everyone views them as a potential murderer. But also the women and other people that walk through the world thinking that, you know, that men are some sort of evil entity. But I think this also further reduces the ability for moderate men to seek help and thus flips the impact that Diggory gives us out of PM. What actually happens to the men who are concerned about toxic masculinity and want to be more understood? Well, I think it makes you feel quite bad, right? If the only depiction of your struggle is from a guy who was literally murdering your parents, you become, in this sense, much more afraid of talking about your mental health struggles. You become afraid that if you tell your therapist that you feel angry at toxic masculinity, that you sometimes have the urge to act on anger, and you're afraid of what you might do as a result of this, that your therapist is going to report you because you are seen as some sort of violent figure. It makes you more hesitant to talk to the people in your life who might understand. We think that this was very negative. I'll talk briefly then about why there were other counter narratives. I think there are, of course, other narratives where you could have just shown that toxic masculinity is bad, but then extrapolated it to less extreme impacts. And so there are things like slice of life family shows where people go like, toxic masculinity made me really sad and made me really depressed. I really struggled to talk about my feelings because of all these expectations around me. And this is a sort of discourse and good discourse that gets displaced by the budget of true crime. Closing.
Yeah, so Andrew Tate also says that fluoride lowers testosterone. Should we stop putting it in the water?
This is an irrelevant POI. The TLDR is that Andrew Tate has stupid takes, but also he has very popular takes, and this is going to be one of the popular takes that is really bad for a lot of people. We think it is bad that these men get shamed and get sprayed and feel like they are violent. They would be better able to talk about it. But I think secondly, even if it is true that some discourse on feminism is difficult to understand, this is, not true of the majority of discourse about toxic masculinity out there. There are things like infographics that are filling the space with accessible discourse on how men can seek help. Second claim then that this reveals a problem with no productive solution that is inherently and intrinsically disgraceful to victims. The way that this is portrayed in media is that some sort of broad societal phenomena has caused someone who killed your child or killed somebody or done some sort of heinous crime to be absolved of their blame, that this amorphous entity was the reason they did that crime. I think this just feels very, angering, right? The fact that this person did have a choice, but the choice and causal factor relation they had to the crime is reduced to something that societal influences. But I also think it's enraging because it is very clear that there are many other people who were toxic men out there who didn't become violent people. And, this seems to excuse all this sort of behavior. We think that this was quite bad. There were other productive solutions you could have talked about. It displaced better narrative. We don't think men can be excused for that.
Thank that member for that exhilarating speech, and now call upon the DPM.
I'll take POIs in chat. Haha, just joking. There is no chat. I will take them verbally, I suppose. Give me 1 second to organize my papers. Okay. Before I begin, I would also like to, of course, thank Degree for dragging me out of being in Beijing to join this tournament online. I'd also like to thank, all of the MDU. It's been a pleasure debating alongside you and against you, and I'm very glad so many of you made finals. And I deeply hope at least an MDU team wins finals. Oh, definitely should not win. Nothing personal, just you're in the wrong club. Okay. I'm going to begin by discussing the way that this narrative looks and why O is deeply wrong about that. And then I'm going to further explain a lot of our impacts and explain why it actually makes the lives of many people better. First of all, O has this claim that is itself actually rather simplistic, that people are like TikTokified, so the narrative has to be really simple. No, when people opt into long form TV shows, they opt into that because they're interested in more complex narratives. People aren't opting into TikTok, that's why they want it. Intuition Pump, watch Mindhunter, which discusses both socioeconomic factors of crime, psychological factors of crime. It goes through many different criminal profiles. Intuition Pump, look at Severance, which discusses a bunch of ways in which people are exploited under capitalism, and also the way that identity is formed. People intentionally want TV shows that are more complicated because they want a break from the TikTokification of the rest of the media. A bunch of reasons then why this media is not extreme. One, many people who do this media are genuinely passionate. They care about good artistic product, but they also care about career advancement, which is often driven by things like critical success. So they aren't just appealing to the lowest common denominator, they also want other people who, for example, have artistic influence to like their media. Two, this is true stories, which means that it's often constrained by genuine facts. So you're not going to do insane shit because, for example, you have responsibility to the true story. People are going to expose you if you lie about what happened in reality. Three, in many cases, you don't want to financially alienate men because you also want them to watch your show. So it's unclear that you're going to be really extreme. And lastly, we do want to point out that even if there's some shows that are particularly bad, I'll explain why the good ones float to the top and become popular. So all we have to show is that there's going to be a variety of shows, and there's going to be sufficient good shows that men are able to connect with them. I'll explain why that's true later. Second claim then on how this alienates men. I want to point out that Degree already explained that men uniquely are able to consume this type of media because they get hooked by the fact that it's true crime and people like watching like blood and gore and stuff. That's pretty cool. This is more likely than, for example, slice of life shows, which many people don't watch. But in particular, I think men are not likely to watch like slice of life shows which subtly show how masculinity is bad for them. And the infographics really, like surely men do not consume feminist infographics. The response to this from OO is, look, Andrew Tate is going to criticize you because he's going to say that it's all a feminist conspiracy. One, this sounds fucking insane to the average person. If you watch a TV show and then the average normie man hears that Andrew Tate say it's a conspiracy by the feminists, it sounds really decredibilizing to Andrew Tate. But furthermore, people are already watching Andrew Tate are out of the scope of the debate. They're probably not going to change their mind either way, and they hate feminists already. So the relevant people are centrists, which there are a lot of. Like most men don't like Andrew Tate, have relatively normie political opinions, and are able to connect with this personally. Why are they uniquely able to connect with this on a deep emotional level? One, men are uniquely portrayed as victims in this narrative compared to other feminist narratives, which oftentimes portray men as uniquely perpetrators. So because men are the ones who are doing the crimes, but also have bad family backgrounds, men feel like they can open up because they don't feel like the narrative is telling them that they're bad, which means that they're able to think about how it affects their life. I think that other feminist narratives are oftentimes rather exclusionary of men because they portray men as, for example, uniquely sexual harassers and only women as the victims. It's a lot easier to think of yourself, more easy to think of yourself as a victor than a perpetrator, as a victim than a perpetrator. So men are more willing to accept this. But two, in many cases, these don't say that they're feminist, which means that it's uniquely able for men to draw experiences. So O's pushes about like feminist infographics say they're feminist, which means that men oftentimes reflectively don't listen to them if they think they're being politically preached to. People don't like being preached to. Whereas media is able to subtly message people. Note that to the extent that Degree explains that you, for example, empathize with characters individually, you're able to develop independent feminist conclusions about how, for example, being abused by your father or being unable to cry or being unable to talk about your mental health is particularly harmful. Last claim is about how this is angering to the families of the victims. I'm just like not sure that they're really going to watch these shows, but furthermore, I think that it's like a harm that we're willing to bite. Degree explains to you that there are many people who are given unnecessarily long prison sentences because we don't see criminals as people and see them as fundamentally different. These humanize criminals by showing them the factors in their past that cause these things, which means that people are more likely to treat criminals better, and that's a massive impact, which outweighs the like relatively few victims of Jeffrey Dahmer, who probably, as I said, aren't exposed to this that much anyway. Yeah. Okay. And then on why this is good, on why there's not that much of a margin for bad media. Most men are going to, by the time they're adults, be exposed to some sort of SJW-owned compilation, some sort of stereotypical straw man of feminism. And so the critical problem here is that I think that it is unlikely that one more bad show is going to change people's minds about feminism. Rather, people probably, to some extent, have already seen bad feminist depictions. The question then is on when there's good shows, how they affect things. And I want to point out that you're likely to have good discussion of the show that is after the fact from the show. So not only do people consume the show itself, and that already makes them empathize, and I want to point out that Degree's mechanism on discussion exists even if the show is bad, because we point out that a lot of people, for example, read on Twitter or talk to their friends. And this means that even bad shows get criticisms that are helpful because people are able to talk about how they do or do not resonate with their experiences. But in many cases, people talk about shows. So for example, that like insane QAnon movie that I don't remember caused a massive discussion about child trafficking, or Taxi Driver caused a massive discussion about things like abuse and mental health. What is the conclusion of this? In many cases, people who didn't even see the show originally are pushed to think about the show's themes because your friends want to discuss something that's influential and interesting to them. Why do the best shows float to the top in discussions? One, people are more likely to discuss things that resonates with their personal experience. If you watch a really shitty show, you might bring that up once, but you're probably not going to bring it up over and over again to your friends and family in different social groups because it's less meaningful to you. But two, I think in many cases, you're likely to discuss things in ways that are relevant to you. So if you talk to your friends and a show has some things that apply to you and some things that don't, you probably talk about the things that do apply to you because they're more interesting to you. Like lots of people talk about Severance because it's a good show. Very few people talk about shitty shows that I can't name because nobody talks about them, although of course we all know that they exist. The bottom line here is that are likely to float to the top and also become popular. They get recommended to you on the Netflix algorithm. So if there's a variety of shows, the ones that are the most popular are the most likely to be good. I'll take a PI from closing if there is one.
Okay, your claim about the way that people treat criminals is batshit. People don't interact with criminals on a day-to-day basis, and you're not going to galvanize prison reform with these shows.
Wait, so I do think that there's a marginal difference in terms of the social attitude that we take towards criminals. The fact that we see criminals as people means that we're less likely to do things like vote for like the death penalty in the US. I think that a massive, but I also think that like people do individually treat criminals in their lives. So for example, people meet ex-cons at work, or they might know people are ex-cons, and I think it's meaningful that they have different treatment of those people. Why is the rise critical? Answering Jalila's, first of all, why is the rise critical? One, people are more likely to see at least one show that's like this if there are more shows that like this. Two, the fact that there's more shows means that there's an incentive for shows to differentiate from each other for market reasons, which means that there's a high variety of these shows, which means that it's more likely that somebody connects with at least one of them. But three, there's an ability to evolve the genre as there's a higher degree of shows, so people see what's resonant and what's successful and are more likely to produce shows that are like that in the future. Why is it critical that this is criminal, not just any other show? One, when people see extreme consequences, they're more likely to reflect on their actions. So if you just see somebody who's like kind of unhappy, it's sort of unclear why that toxic masculinity is so bad. But if you see something like actual murder, then you're more likely to be like, oh, this is an unhealthy pattern of behavior. But two, the critical mechanism is that these are true stories in many cases. So people don't feel like it's a contrived fake thing that's made up for the thing, for the show. They feel like this is an actual story of what happened, except that it feels more, that it has more credibility. They're more likely to reflect on their behavior. What happens? People are more likely to see parts of their lives that are bad and their own actions are bad. They're more likely to go to therapy or reconsider their emotional state or the way that they treat their childhood. In many cases, this might make people mildly less violent, but I think it also makes them more open to other people's experiences. It also makes them more empathetic to other people. You're probably not going to think that you're going to be a criminal just because of like the shows, but I think it means that you're more empathetic.
We thank that member for that awe-inspiring speech, and now invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Leader. The two leader.
Thanks, Emily, for coming here. Thanks my auto bid tournament winners, Ias and Nick. Thanks, Anais, for literally enabling my entire debate career. No Anais, no me. I would never have the money to go anywhere. I just like work 100 hours a week for the EDS. Good luck. I was gonna thank Anders, but he was mean to me. No thanks to you. This debate is going to be won or lost on the margins. No one is going to fucking fix prison reform over a few shows. We are not going to have a cultural change in the tide where swaths of men become more empathetic and based. This is probably about the way that the viewers of these shows react positively or negatively. Not about counterfactual media because there's infinite slot machines. Streaming services are turning out tons of them. Is this media going to produce positive or negative reactions? We say the latter. First, is this likely to be done well? Cleaning up this clash. Anders says writers are really passionate and people care about their artistic shit. And also there are super smart people who gravitate to smarter shows and not TikTok slop. Responding in reverse, the people who gravitate towards smarter shows are probably smart enough to not be beating their fucking children and doing stupid toxic masculine stuff in the first place. If you understand nuance, if you understand cycles of interpersonal violence, you're probably not the kind of man who needs to be improved. I don't think Severance viewers are evil, low IQ individuals. On the idea that the writers of these shows are passionate, I think the issue is it doesn't matter if they have an incentive to create good shit, the capacity is not there. Why? One, most media is literally bad. Streaming services need to constantly churn out new shows in order to keep people paying for them, because if you just watch all the things in the catalog, you no longer have any reason to keep your subscription. This is why they're incentivized to make as much new shit as possible all the fucking time. This means, especially with the rise of this media, that most of the shows created are going to be mid-tier on a production level. They're going to have writers who are not as experienced and are not being paid very much. They're not going to have high budgets for nuanced lighting and shit. It's going to be corny as hell. It doesn't matter if the writers are theoretically smart and woke, because they're also broke. They work as contractors. They have to output shit for as many shows as possible to make enough money to survive in a year. Even if they want to be auteurs, they can't. They probably have to compress stuff down to the lowest possible entertaining denominator. OG says discourse fixes everything. A couple of responses. First, most TV viewers aren't doing x.com think posts about the shows that they watch. I think that typically services that are making these shows care more about viewership and the silent majority than the loud woke minority. And so discourse is not actually going to fix this, because it empirically remains true that most people do like the slop. They don't comment on it. They do click on it, and the slop keeps getting made. Second mech that OG gives is people see this stuff and they connect. I think they probably don't connect. I'm going to get on now to why men have visceral negative reactions to this kind of media, especially if they watch the median value one, which is going to be unnuanced and mid. I think Anders says it's easier to see yourself as a victim than a perpetrator. The problem is that in these shows, the victims become the perpetrators. Maybe you could theoretically connect with the idea of being sad because your dad hit you and shit. The issue is you probably have sequencing bias. Once you see the end of the show where being hit leads to someone murdering someone, you're going to be like, that's fucking ridiculous and that's dramatized, and I don't really see the value in this narrative. There's an inherent disconnect. No one believes that they could be a murderer. No one walks away with this for more empathy empathy and shit. Comparative on who gets less toxic masculinity. The first thing I want to claim is that literally nothing would be better than men watching these shows, i.e. if they logged off Touch Grass, there were no comparative like depictions of toxic masculinity, this would still be better. Why? I think that typically men have other mechanisms for resolving toxic masculinity, sometimes in real life at least, when they're not polarized against the idea that it might be a problem in the first place. I.e., if you're in your boys group chat and one of the boys is making really weird, sexist comments or something, some of the other boys in that group chat might think that's a little odd, and they might push back on you at some point and say I would like it if you stop doing this, is making me uncomfortable. Same thing if you're being hit by other men. Probably at some point, people are gonna be like, this boy getting hit a lot is crying. Maybe this is negative, I don't know. People don't like being treated poorly. People don't like being hurt. Without these depictions, they eventually maybe moderate this out. Second thing is there are some woke men out there. They are somewhat dispersed throughout friend groups. There are men who are more predisposed against this. I think all you need is one in a friend group and discourse happens. I think that men can connect with each other, and they do in real life. This is why toxic masculinity is on the downturn. I'll take closing. Tell me your case.
No, I won't.
Oh, I'm sure you won't. Fine.
So the comparative peer is not this or Ted Lasso. If you like true crime, you probably continue to watch true crime. Why is this better than the alternative?
You probably watch this and also lots of true crime. I think the alternative of other true crime, true crime is all kind of myth. I just think that this is particularly a flattening of toxic masculinity that harms people. I would rather the comparative be literally anything else that's not compressed political narrative clickbait. Maybe that wouldn't polarize people. So they try to strawman us and be like, oh, you're just saying Andrew Tate gets fuel. Should we never talk against feminism? No, I don't think so. I think it's reasonable to say that some men who might be amenable to the idea that toxic masculinity are bad, maybe pull back away from that when it's extrapolated to toxic masculinity creates murderers. Okay, finally, on the comparative, I don't think it's literally nothing. I do think there are other depictions of toxic masculinity that make the discourse fine and available. Their response to our Ted Lasso POI is, no men watch that. Men like blood and gore. First of all, there are other kinds of shows that have blood and stuff. I would rather superhero movies talk about toxic masculinity. I don't like the MCU, but I'm sure the median man who goes and sees a Thor suffering and being shamed for being fat and being sad connects with that and is like, wow, my heroes can be vulnerable. Maybe I can be vulnerable too. Second, I guess just normal dramas that aren't fucking dramatizations of people's lives probably depict this stuff. And also the idea that men only watch blood and gore because fighting, that's kind of silly. I think men just watch whatever's sort of trending and pops up on the Netflix homepage. They're going to see depictions that are more nuanced, they're more disconnected from the idea of being a murderer, on the counterfactual. Finally, on the criminals argument, this is an extremely high threshold argument for it to have any impact. Making 5% of the entire population more sympathetic to criminals does not change anything. They're not interacting with criminals in fucking prisons, and they are not going to be able to vote in a politician who treats criminals better in prison. What the hell, dude? I don't know why I should care about societal attitudes people have towards people they're never going to interact with or vote for. I don't think they prove that you get enough change that people do vote in politicians that are nicer to criminals, especially since probably not more than half the population is watching this show. I don't think a tiny median increase in empathy is worth anything compared to the impact of flattening narratives in a way that is disrespectful to victims and makes men feel worse.
I thank that member for their jubilant speech and now invite the member of government.
I really want to respond to opening opposition because I'm really unclear what the terminal impact of their case is. It seems quite uncomparative to me that, in absence of these sorts of shows, you're just going to get really great discussions. You're going to get really great, pushes of feminism and, awareness of toxic masculinity. They do talk about how, in the worst cases, this can be quite harmful. I think there are a lot of mitigations there. So in the worst cases, very often algorithms have, filters that you can use. Algorithms don't like violence. Advertisers don't like their message being associated with inflammatory and hateful types of shit. So I think all of the worst types of things coming out of opening opposition are out of this debate. The thesis from closing government is very clear. The rise of this type of media fosters buy-in for a view of human behavior where decisions and crimes are primarily socially determined. Firstly, we're going to explain why behavior is often socially determined. I think firstly, this is just the general consensus among most experts. Things like poverty drive you to make crimes of desperation because you literally need to feed yourself, or you're just unable to, make a clear decision when you are hungry and feeling sick, so on and so forth. Secondly, you learn from your surroundings. So if you grew up in an environment where violence was rewarded because it made you feel strong, or other people used violence as a means of gaining social status, this might be how you grow to see the world and how you grow to interact with the world. I think this is general consensus among experts in human behavior and criminology. I'm not going to spend too much time proving the burden, but that's already more than what Diggory provides us in his speech. The second burden that I want to fill is to explain why this actually creates support for that view, and then explaining how that makes the world a better place. So why does this create support for the view? Well, let's discuss the counterfactual, right? Something that top half neglected very sorely. What is the counterfactual? There is a huge niche for crime media. Why? There is an existing niche for this sort of thing. Millions of people engage in watching, cop TV shows or true crime or all these like podcasts and stuff where they explore criminals and, stuff. And the reason this is true is because number one, a fan base already exists. We know that to be empirically true. Number two, it's flashy. It feels cool. It's engaging. Number three, people like gore. They think that it's interesting. They think it's, a side of the world that they haven't really engaged with, so on and so forth. Why is this worse? Well, firstly, we can just cross-apply all of the shit that we hear from opening opposition. It is worse because there are huge media incentives to make like gooner content for people who want to brain rot and like scroll through TikTok. They make very simplistic narratives. But secondly, is that they likely do not engage at all with the side of the criminal or the side of the individual who is actually committing these acts. So it's not necessarily criminals, and 13 reasons why, for example, it's not all criminals. These types of media, the counterfactual media, will not show it from a criminalist perspective. And then thirdly, I think that existing narratives that we have all grown up with, the hero's journey, but also just media in general, is that criminals are bad, criminals are evil, and when you do bad shit, that's because you're an evil person, right? We all have interacted or watched something where the villain, the big bad, that person is just bad. There's no nuance to that character. You don't see them from their perspective. You don't understand what is, causing these decisions to be made. I think in our world, you actually do get that side of things, which does nuance and does soften the types of narratives that the vast majority of people are exposed to. Why is this a good thing? Well, note that there are just a finite amount of, productions and time that you can spend making types of movie and TV. There's only so much advertising you can put towards things, and people have a limited amount of time to watch these sorts of things, which means that this will displace worse content, as we've proven, and this outweighs what OG brings to the table, because even if they prove that you have some media that is good, we have just proven that the future of media is likely to be much worse. And so even if you have one instance of engaging with media that is good, it is probably much worse to have an infinite amount of future media that is much, much worse, and you never change the narrative, you never change the types of things that are accepted in media. The second mechanism on why this creates buy-in is because this creates discourse. And I'm going to nuance this a little bit, right? Note that people literally debate about these topics in university settings, but people also talk online about it. You post on Reddit after every episode, comes out. You discuss with your friends about these sorts of things. But the nuance here, the critical piece, is that this is done from a white perspective, right? White individuals, young white men are the people who are the most prone to turning to the alt-right or turning to, conservative perspectives and all of the things that, off-bench seems to fear. But notably, when you have a Jeffrey Dhamer and you have a 13 Reasons Why, or the whatever the fuck brothers, these are all white characters. You're seeing how they make decisions. You're humanizing them. And so that's an easier avenue of young white men to connect to these sorts of narratives, which means that it's much more easier for them to buy into these sorts of things, again, outweighing what we get from top half. I think lastly is that these narratives actually focus on the decisions behind, bad shit or why people do, heinous acts. It doesn't just elide them and then try to oh my God, look at how cool this crime was. Look at how much blood there was. And then the police got them and they went to jail forever. Before I go on and explain why this is so good, Vijay.
You've given a fantastic case about social determinism, but you haven't said the word masculinity a single time. Could you explain what the motion is actually about?
Emotion is about how we interact with individuals. And I think that when you engage with this narrative, it isn't necessarily about, actually, I'll get there. You'll see. Why is this good? When I discuss with other individuals about, homelessness, I tell them that the reason you should support homelessness, even if you think they're disgusting, even if you think they are like crawling the streets, is because most of them were in the foster system and most of them were failed severely and were abused as children. They're homeless and they commit crimes, not because they're actually bad people, because it was socially determined. And this is something that is actually quite effective in garnering empathy. Why is this so good? One, it reaches millions of people, and that means daily acts of compassion. When you see the lonely boy in the classroom and you've watched this sort of show, you now feel like, I'm going to soften my understanding of them. Maybe they're going through a similar type of crisis. Maybe I have the cognitive empathy to talk to them or not ridicule them or not say mean shit to them. This scales to millions of interactions. I think this is important. This is the homeless man on the corner when you say, why don't you get a job? Instead of doing that, you don't do that. Secondly, catharsis for people in similar situations. There are millions of people in the United States who are in prison. Those people have access to books and media. They can read things like 13 Reasons Why, see it from their perspective, and feel, maybe I'm not to blame. Maybe it's okay. Maybe life will be good. Thirdly, is that for the young men who do resonate with these messages, who do feel like broken men, for the millions of individuals who think this represents me, they are unlikely to take the violent path because they see that it ends poorly. They see themselves in these characters. They see that the violence was not the right answer, that violence only led to more violence, that violence led to consequences, and they are less likely to do things like school shootings or do things like crime. For all of those reasons,
Thank that member for that heavenly speech, and now invite the member of awe.
Agree with closing government, that shows like Ted Lasso are not substitute goods for true crime shows where people literally watch Jeffrey Dahmer do cannibalism. The MCU is not a solution. You don't want to watch Thor get fat and have lighthearted laughs about that when what you intended to watch was a gritty show about the Menendez brothers killing their own parents and the horrible amounts of like molestation and trauma that they experienced growing up. What we are going to do on Closing Opposition is simple. We're going to prove that the true crime genre, which will always have a massive consumer base, is going to improve in a way where it becomes actively positive for society, and this will weigh above OO by proving an actual benefit rather than simply the absence of harm. Second, we're going to provide unique reasons why it is that the problem with these shows in the status quo is that they identify a problem when it comes to masculinity, but they provide zero solution, and how that turns men towards the alt-right. Don't clap, there were many gaps in the way you made it. First, then, on why it is that, I want to fill in the counterfactual and explain why it is that true crime shows get better on our side. I think that there are I think that the audience for true crime is always going to exist for many of the reasons that teams have already established in the debate. It provides people with a thrill. It's the type of television show that you cannot turn off. You want to know what happens. You find these stories of human terror to be interesting. You find the psychology that backs these things fascinating. I think this has largely been established in the debate. Why is it then that I think, or what other narratives end up being depicted in these shows when you cannot have the narratives of male failure, basically? I think you get narratives that end up being more specific and actionable in terms of the problems they identify for society. For example, how society treats victims who have survived sexual violence, what their experience with the legal system is like. When you look at stories like, for example, the Menendez brothers, who were largely believed to face massive amounts of this when they were children. There are examples of this. Look to Unbelievable on Netflix, which became massively popular by exploring this story. Look to stories about the justice system neglecting people of color or queer men, i.e. you can literally do this with the Jeffery Dhamer story. This is a massive example of this. I think that these narratives are better, first of all, because they are more specific, but also because they're actionable. They say, this is a problem, but we can fix it by fixing the justice system or by believing victims that come forward, etc. I think that the reason why you get these depictions instead is threefold. Many of these narratives just naturally fit into the stories because of just the way reality works, i.e. many criminals decide to prey on vulnerable people in society. Look at missing and murdered Indigenous women. This is something that's relatively easy to fit within the narrative because it's just the truth of the situation. So it emerges quite easily. Second, I think that lots of the writers that work on these shows research these things. They like understand true crime. This is the area they're specialized in. As other teams in this debate tell you, they're like relatively woke, so they probably care about this. If they're willing to write about like masculinity and how it's broken, they're likely to choose other progressive issues to spotlight instead. But the third reason is just that this is done well. There's empirics we can point to. There's many examples in Netflix TV shows that have done this successfully. Look to things like Unbelievable. There was like another movie that I think was maybe made about Ted Bundy that like actually did this relatively well, I'm pretty sure. I think that there are just proven that we can do this well. But I think the other reason why this probably ends up happening well is what I've already identified in terms of the incentives of writers, but also because it resonates with people. Because, you know, like women who fear that they're going to be victims of sexual violence themselves watch the show and it resonates with them. They want to like see the system improved. These issues are relatable to people. I think that this is important for a few reasons. First, I think that note that, as I mentioned, comedies are not a substitute good for true crime, and this overcomes what the problem that OG points about and co-ops the arguments that they raise. We prove that you are actually able to get solutions for problems that exist. Second, I think that we provide an active benefit by proving that the discussions you have in the counterfactual are going to be better, and that you're going to have other social issues be raised in true crime rather than just like the absence of harm that OO brings up in the debate. Second, I want to talk about why it is that these types of programs provide a problem but provide no solution. Before I go on, if yeah, sure, closing.
Yeah, no one wants to watch a TV show that ends with like a policy prescription of the 20 things that we should do to reform the social justice system.
I mean, Dope Sick was massively popular and it provided like a bunch of ways that we can like fix the opioid crisis. This is just an assertion. I think people actually do like this because they find that it's hopeful and they like knowing that there's ways to address bad things in society. Like you get a nice pleasant ending after like all the horror you've watched and it makes you feel hopeful about the world. People like it. Okay, moving on then. I think the problem with the way that men internalize this is that most people, and this is the problem that exists in opening opposition, most men aren't gonna like watch the story of Jeffrey Dahmer and be like, well, I'm probably a killer. They're gonna think like, well, I'm not a serial killer. I've never wanted to eat anyone's brains. So it's not clear from the OO case why it is that men actually perceive this as an attack on them. I think the reason this actually happens is twofold. First, men feel that they are told that they drive each other to evil. So even if they're not the one that's going to do the shooting, they feel that they create conditions for their friends to end up executing this. But second, I think that some aspects of masculinity do actually resonate with men, and seeing it attacked makes them feel hopeless. So, you know, they derive like some meaning from being a protector. It makes them feel like they have a role in their life, that they like provide for their family. And also they like stoicism because that makes them feel like emotionally resilient, etc. These things resonate with a lot of men. And when you attack masculinity and say that these things lead to bad outcomes, they feel that their actual life philosophies are being attacked. I think the impact of this is that men feel lost because these shows provide them with nothing to aspire to. It's a problem, but not a solution. The Menendez brothers did not achieve closure. Jeffrey Dahmer did not magically like see the light at the end of the tunnel of like, oh, I'm going to talk to my friends about their feelings and then I'll stop killing people. No, that's just false. I think that what uniquely happens then is because these shows depict masculinity in such a negative way that they functionally throw the baby out with the bathwater, men then turn to the alt-right and become more susceptible to these types of depictions because it provides them with an alternative, and it says masculinity is actually good because it says, you know, like you're and then the impact of this is that men end up feeling, for example, they need to like seek female subservience. They interpret the worst versions of masculinity because only figures on the right are telling them this is something that's salvageable and beneficial, and it's something that already resonates with them. I want to contrast this with the other characterization that I've provided. Note that the sum of these two arguments is that we've proven that on the counterfactual, you get actionable things being depicted that can actually provide solutions and benefits in society. But the problem with these true crime stories is that the main characters are not salvageable. They're like the worst of the worst. We don't have ways to address their problems. They get no salvation at the end of the day, whereas focusing on victims uniquely are able to do that. I think what that means is that we have tangible benefits on our side, and we've also filled in the gaps of why it is that men actually internalize these narratives. For those reasons, proud to oppose.
I thank that member for a sagacious speech and now invite the government whip.
Before I begin, I promise I'll keep it super short. Obviously, thank you to everyone who I've debated with and people I debated with to help me, be allowed to debate here, kind of thing. The one thing I want to quickly note is I think that this is a great initiative, and I hope it keeps growing and gets better. But I think we also just need to keep working on making sure there's more inclusion of different regions, and also I think in-person inclusion. I really don't want hybrids to just become the default for not making sure that people from different places come. I'm sure you can talk to all of them. I think it's obviously much worse to debate online than it is in person, why I refuse to do into it. So the other thing about it, this isn't like the tournament's fault or any individual reason. I just think as a circuit, we need to work harder on making sure that we actually get more in-person participation from across the region. Otherwise, people are just going to stop swimming. Okay, cool. With that being said, I'll jump right into it. While it is true that most people do not interact with criminals in their day-to-day, they probably interact with people who eventually become criminals, and they interact with people who might be school shooters, and importantly, they definitely, statistically, do interact with people who consider taking their own life or who take their own life due to things like depression, due to things like isolation, due to things that are often onset due to toxic masculinity and the inability to reach out. The J seems to have a problem with how many times we said masculinity. So masculinity. What happened in my partner's speech, but I think it's obviously very clear how this all his analysis applies. I think you judges are probably smart enough to do like a little bit of the same, cross application of that thing. But I want to be really clear. Uniquely, what this narrative is about the social expectations of masculinity placed upon men, right? Fundamentally, it is about the impossible ways that men have to live up to certain standards of being tough and, providers and all these types of things, but they can't cry all that stuff. The same way that there's toxic things pushed on women and people around the world. Why is this extremely important for this debate, and why do we think this carries it? Because it enables the types of conversations that OO seems to think we want to have with your boys. And I think it's a lot easier to talk about those types of things when there's a reference point, rather just be like, hey lads, isn't it hard to cry sometimes? It's obviously much better if you can point to certain things. But here's what I'm going to do for you. First of all, I'm going to engage with the CO because I do think this is largely a back half debate. I will explain why. Extremely clear, and mainly because of lack of engagement with counterfactual, but I will go through those themes, I promise, and give them a charitable take. I think the main problem with CO's case is, to some degree, they want their cake and eat it too. They want to show super nuanced and detailed depictions of victim suffering, but they also still want to appeal to men. I'm sorry, it's going to be really hard to tell a story about like mass rape in the US, for example, on college campuses, such as the hunting ground, but then also still get the buy-in from men, and also still tell us in a way that isn't a documentary. Like, at the end of the day, this is still true crime. I'm just really unclear what are these perfect nuanced things that, again, apparently end with a massive police group shooting. But even if you don't buy that, they suffer from the same problem as OG, where they just have no solvency for why learning about what's wrong with the criminal justice system leads to any of those reforms. Uniquely, what we tell you on our side is, guess what? When you read these stories, you are less likely to fight the person who starts pushing you in the locker room because you actually realize they probably were beaten by their father and therefore have these aggressive tendencies because this is what they were told it means to man. You're less likely to bully the kid in the back and call him a school shooter and call him an incel and call him Jeffrey Dahmer, because you realize there are complexities as to why some kids smell worse, why some kids can't afford clothes, all these types of things. These are the things that are depicted in these types of stories, which is uniquely that it is the social variables around people that put them into positions that make them do antisocial behavior. And understand that can apply across the level. This isn't just about serial killers. Like, right? Adolescence is literally about a boy radicalized to the alt-right. So I think you can have these types of things. This isn't all the only thing that matters. Why this matters is we have obviously the most proximate immediate impact. You know who watches a lot of these TV shows? Teenage boys. You know who interact with a lot of people in pain? Teenage boys. You know what would be great is if they took on messages that told them, actually, you aren't at fault for some of the bad things, but that also means other people in your life aren't at fault for bad things that happen to you. You should have empathy for the circumstances that put people in. And too importantly, it doesn't mean that you have to think they will become a serial killer. Like, you obviously intuit that there are degrees along this way, which is also why all these stories aren't just about serial killers. They're about a variety of things, kind of thing. They're about the tragedies that people commit when they feel like they have no place to go. I don't think CO can access their goods there. And I also just don't think that they get these types of stories told, kind of thing. Because unfortunately, inherently, to tell a lot of stories about the horrors of the system, you also then need to tell them that men are often the problem in these things. A lot of the reasons why we have poor criminal justice reform and stuff like that is because men like punitive justice systems and things like that kind of thing. It's going to be really hard to balance that thing. Also make that a TV show that anyone wants to fucking watch. I think our comparative is much better. I also think the comparative brought up my partner is far better, which is the most likely comparator because it's what literally existed before this took over, which is what the idea is there are evil people among us who don't look like you, but you don't know who they are. Look everywhere around. This looks like literally every story you've ever seen before this. This is just the basis of true crime. This is why Serial was the #1 podcast in the US for like 10 years kind of thing. I think this is just obviously the more like the counterfactual. They have to defend the status quo or what would have likely been not their like magical reality of why that is. I'll give them actually, we should still do long diagonals. Go ahead.
Man, wait, that's crazy. Are you saying that shows that depict men as being the structural problem who are creating these serial killers are actually bad and men don't want to watch them?
See, I just don't understand this idea of just because men will misinterpret things, we shouldn't have them. You just literally couldn't have any fucking meaning. Like 10 minutes on why Eminem's not sexy enough and what is the end of the American society. They would probably just move to the next closest thing. They're always going to make grifter content. We shouldn't cater to them. They never explain why this is unique in any way. I honestly don't care. Why are both front half teams out of this debate really quickly? First of all, on OO. First, I just say this won't be done well because it's like there's not enough money. Holy fuck. Half of these shows were from Netflix. They literally have $1 billion budget for TV shows. This is obviously just not true. Then they tell you that the counterfactual is literally anything else. This is obviously like just an insane statement. I'm sure they would defend the counterfactual of killing women good. That's a possible counterfactual. So it can't just be anything. They tell you that the counterfactual could be nothing. In what fucking world do people be like, oh no, there's none of this thing. I'm just gonna stare at the screen and do nothing. Obviously, people have a revealed preference for wanting to watch true crime. They're going to continue to watch true crime. What they probably choose between is this on our side, or they choose between what came before, which is stories of people are evil, look out, they're scary because it excites you in the ways that Seed literally tells me. They never tell me why a story about like how the criminal justice system was broken in 1965 is going to be a compelling story for any human being ever. Also, I just don't think they ever prove. And also, I think their discourse metric back. Why does OG follow? First of all, they just shoot for insane impacts with absolutely no ability to prove it. Why do you get criminal justice reform unclear? Why do you get these super complicated conversations? But they also just assume discourse is inherently good. It's possible for people, like, there's been a lot of discourse about trans rights because of, like, J.K. Rowling. It's become increasingly polarized. It's unclear why just, like, discourse on things is good. I think it can also go the other way where people now are just, like, stigmatized and believe things. Finally, they just don't have a counterfactual. They literally say dry feminist literature. Obviously, our reveal preferences for the reasons that Andrew tell you to be true crime. True crime people watch true crime stuff. We have better true crime. Vote for us.
Their speech, and now invite the opposition whip.
Super quickly before I start, thank yous are lame, but I was gonna say, you know who I would thank. So fucking for real, I probably don't need to give this whip. I think it's quite a clear win for us. Two fronts. Firstly, what is actually the counterfactual? Because every other team in the room lies to you and hides it with big words that are lies. The second is why this internalization happens. Beyond just its Andrew Tate mech, we actually explain how modders are not going to be able to internalize this well. What do we give you? And then why does it beat CO? Maybe they're winning. I can't really tell, actually. The first thing, what is the counterfactual instead? We think by a lot of the mechanization that we get from CG, the likely counterfactual is some form of social determinism or nuanced perspectives on what leads to crime. The reason that this is true is because they can't just say that something was a way and then something was a different way, but it would have continued to be that way had it not been this way. Really, what they explain in their own case is that social determinism is good, and I stand by my POI. I don't really understand why their case is like exclusive to masculinity and why it shouldn't instead be something like poverty, which is really the general consensus that they agree is the reason for the vast majority of crime. But given this, I think it's far more plausible that we get our counterfactual, which is a solutions-driven response and analysis of how crime happens. There are two responses that they get. The first is that it's hard to tell these stories in a nuanced way. One, because men are the root cause of all evil, and two, because nuance is hard. The nuance is hard thing is symmetrical, and actually gets much easier on our side, if anything, because of the fact that these solutions are often relatively straightforward, like the punitive justice system is bad. But also, I don't actually think we need to explain that men were the root cause of the punitive justice system to get reforms on the punitive justice system. The second claim, then, is that there's no solvency. The first thing is, insofar as you believe the batshit bullshit claims from OG about any prison reform, you should believe our stuff more strongly. But more importantly, I do actually think there is some amount of solvency. Why? Because people are influenced by the media that they watch, and they are likely to take action in their day-to-day life or in the way that they vote. This is how social change happens, and the only way that it actually manifests productively is when people are given a clear solution, a clear way forward, which is not done when you are told that the problem is this ephemeral thing, which is toxic masculinity, which is baked so deeply into our culture through stoicism and through Andrew Tate that is extremely hard to root out just by being kind to people in discrete instances. So, the second thing then on why internalization is done poorly. The only thing that OO gives, and they're about to emote, don't let them lie to you, is that people don't like being portrayed as criminals. More importantly than this, and more importantly than what we get in terms of this like Andrew Tate stuff, is how the moderates actually feel about this. The first thing is, they don't relate to the characters, and that's bad. But more importantly than that, people don't like to feel like they are the root cause. Like their behavior, the way that they raise their kids, the way that they interact with their friends are what is going to cause crime. This goes beyond what OO says. The second thing is that for many people, masculinity is actually deeply important to their personality. And I would actually argue that parts of masculinity are maybe a good thing. We have debates about stoicism all the time because it's sort of unclear whether it's good or bad. The third thing is that I think people like agents. They want to believe that they have some ability to control the actions that they have. And this sort of idea that they are not responsible at all for what they're saying is just not very appealing. The implication of all of this is that both government teams don't really access their impacts in terms of how people are going to internalize this in a way that is useful and helpful and productive and means that they're less likely to get bullied. I'll take back half.
Yeah, so your partner concedes that a few people of the general population watch this. How do you get meaningful change on things like social reforms? Isn't it a lot easier to just not bully the kid in the corner?
Okay, a couple of things. The first thing is, again, I'm still sort of unclear why we can't not bully the kid in the corner because of reasons like poverty, and which are much easier to explain than masculinity. But secondly, I do actually think that media is important to inform how people believe, given all of your mechanization on why true crime is such a huge base of people and people who want to watch it. But more directly responsive to CG. Holy nice. Why is this the tipping point in terms of people realizing that violence is bad? Hello? Walk the fuck in?
POI.
School shootings are bad, not because it's caused by masculinity, but because school shootings are bad. Criminals feel better? They're in prison. They have been told by the state that the mens rea, the feeling, the agency that they have, is the reason that they're there. I'm not compelled that this media is reaching them in a way that will make them feel better. The idea that you're going to be kinder to sad men. Maybe. Maybe they can win on this margin. I'm not doing it. Really. Two responses. Firstly, I'm still unclear why this is well. Secondly, people watch other sorts of media. Not everybody is only watching true fucking crime. It's sort of unclear to me why Ted Lasso, credit to OO, isn't a sufficient way to access what they're talking about here. Paul's emoting so much, but he's losing the round. Okay, OG says that there's it's gonna be done well. This entire case, if you flow through and deal with what response we get from OO, comes down to the idea that the best content will be filtered to the top through discussion and discourse. But they admit that lots of people who discuss this art won't have actually seen it, which means that they are not going to get good and nuanced discussion about it because of the pervasiveness of short form content to be the hellhole that is Twitter discussions and letterbox quips. This is, if anything, where OO's material about Andrew Tate comes in, because that's how they pollute the discourse, not in this way that Andrew Tate man will get worse, but just that the discourse isn't actually meaningfully good. The other thing about OG is just that they're the margin here is that there's a different audience for who's watching true crime. If it comes down to that in the debate, just fuck it, whatever, it's fine. But the last thing, and engaging directly with the criminality thing. I think CG probably does a better job here. Yeah, to their credit. But I think my response to them also tracks back to OG. My POI was maybe a bit facetious, but I do think it's the case that they did a worse job proving than what we do in our counterfactual why it's the case that you were likely to get solvency on these reforms. It seems somewhat unclear to me that people are going to link masculinity to some sort of big prison reform that leads to people being less punitive. Lastly, OO, I guess there's a chance they're winning.
No.
I think they fumble the counterfactual. Infographics aren't the counterfactual. They are memed on this enough. Ted Lasso is counterfactual because people like true crime. We do a much better job explaining to me what the counterfactual actually looks like and why it's actually much better. And we do a much better job explaining to you why this is internalized so poorly as to be actively harmful, not just their mitigatory stuff to OG. So, the way. We give you an actual case with actual real images. We explain to you why, if you believe there's any solvency on prison reform, it's going to come from us, and why people are going to internalize this narrative in a way that is meaningfully good for getting better, productive societies. I've been very mean, and I've been joking a lot, but really track the flow, we're winning this debate.